Why don't you just disappear? My daughter turned on me, and her mother backed her up. It all began with a single, haunting question. Why don't you just disappear? Those 5 words shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. What followed was a battle to uncover the truth, lies, betrayal, and a shocking revelation that changed my life forever. What really happened between my daughter, my wife, and me? Stay tuned, because the answer will leave you stunned. The day started out like any other, or so I thought. I was at the kitchen counter, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the room as I poured myself a cup. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow across the backyard. It was peaceful, almost deceptively so. Little did I know, everything I thought I knew about my family was about to unravel. As I took my first sip, I glanced at the framed picture on the counter, me, my wife Maris, and our daughter Vesper, all smiling together during a camping trip 2 years ago. I remember how happy we looked back then, standing by the lake with a massive catch of fish strung up on a line. Vesper's grin was ear to ear as she held up the biggest trout, her excitement contagious. Those were the moments I lived for, the moments that made the long hours at work, the sleepless nights, the daily grind, all worth it. But lately, that light in her eyes had dimmed. At 16, Vesper was pulling away, retreating into her own world. I told myself it was just a phase. Teenagers go through that, don't they? They're supposed to be distant, moody, secretive. That's what I kept repeating, even as that nagging feeling in my gut told me otherwise. It started with the small things. Vesper stopped eating dinner with us as often. She'd come home from school and head straight to her room, the door clicking shut before I even had a chance to say hi. When I did see her, she barely looked up from her phone. It was always fine or whatever when I asked how her day went. The laughter that used to echo through our house had been replaced by silence. Maris tried to reassure me. She's just growing up, Maddox, she said one night as we sat on the couch, the television murmuring softly in the background. She'll come around. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the change in Vesper felt deeper, like something more than just teenage angst. There was a distance in her eyes, a wall she'd put up that I couldn't seem to break through. And Maris seemed more distracted than usual. She brushed off my concerns, but I could tell she was holding something back. There were moments when she'd go quiet mid-conversation, her expression unreadable. It was subtle, but I noticed. I notice everything when it comes to my family. One night, after yet another awkward dinner, where Vesper had barely touched her food, I decided to try again. She was sitting on the living room couch, scrolling through her phone, the faint glow of the screen illuminating her face. I sat down next to her, close enough to show I cared, but not so close that she'd feel cornered. "Hey, Ves," I began softly. "Everything okay? I feel like we haven't talked much lately." She didn't even glance up. "I'm fine, Dad." Her tone was flat, indifferent. "You sure?" I pressed gently. "If there's something bothering you, you can tell me. You know I'm here, right?" For a brief second, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, hesitation. Maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I'm fine," she repeated, her voice cold. It stung more than I cared to admit. This was my daughter, the little girl who used to run into my arms when I came home from work, who would beg me to read her just one more bedtime story. Where had that connection gone? Maris entered the room then, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. She gave me a look, the kind that said, "Leave it alone." And so I did, though it went against every instinct I had. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing Vesper. I had always been the protector, the one who kept our family grounded. But now I felt helpless, like I was standing on the sidelines watching something slip through my fingers. The real blow came a few days later. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those rare days when I didn't have a million things on my to-do list. I suggested a family movie night, something lighthearted, a classic we could all enjoy. Maris agreed reluctantly, but Vesper just shrugged and said, "I'm not in the mood." I tried not to let the rejection show on my face. "Come on, Ves," I said, forcing a smile. "It'll be fun. We'll make popcorn, pick something you like." I said I'm not in the mood, she snapped, standing up and heading toward the stairs. I followed her, keeping my tone calm. "Vesper, can we talk for a minute?" She stopped at the foot of the stairs, her hand on the railing, and finally turned to face me. Her expression was one I hadn't seen before, distant, almost cold. "What?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Why don't you just disappear?" The words hit me like a gut punch. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I'd just heard. "What?" I managed to say, though my voice came out in a whisper. "You heard me," she said, her tone steady, almost emotionless. "Why don't you just disappear?" For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't just teenage rebellion. This was something else entirely. I searched her face for any sign that she didn't mean it, that it was just a heat of the moment comment. But her eyes stayed locked on mine, unflinching. Then Maris stepped in. "Vesper, that's enough," she said, her tone firm but not angry. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable, and then she turned and walked upstairs, leaving me standing there alone. Vesper followed her without another word, her footsteps fading down the hall. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty staircase. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, hurt, and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had I gone from being the father who tucked her in at night, who carried her on his shoulders at the fair, to someone she wanted to disappear? I felt a heaviness settle in my chest, a weight I couldn't shake. I thought about the picture on the counter, the three of us smiling by the lake. I thought about all the little moments: Sunday morning pancakes, driving her to school, cheering her on at her soccer games. Those memories felt so distant now, like they belonged to another family. I walked into the kitchen and stood by the counter, staring at that picture. My hands gripped the edge of the counter as I tried to steady myself. The house was so quiet, the kind of quiet that felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be that way. It used to be filled with laughter, with conversation, with life. Now it felt empty. I didn't know what was going on with Vesper, and I didn't know why Maris seemed so detached. I just knew that something had shifted, something I couldn't put into words yet. And as I stood there, staring at that picture, I realized that my family, the one thing I thought I could always count on, was slipping away from me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, Vesper's expression as she spat those words at me, cold and unyielding. The way Maris just walked off without a fight. The silence that filled the house afterward. It played over and over in my mind like a broken record, and each replay felt worse than the last. What had I done to deserve this? I'd given everything to my family. I'd always been there. I'd always cared. How could she ask me to disappear as if I meant nothing? How could Maris agree, even silently, as if we hadn't built this life together? The darkness of the room seemed heavier than usual, pressing down on me. I stared at the ceiling, my chest tightening as the minutes ticked by. I tried to push the thoughts away, to tell myself it was just another teenage outburst, that things would look different in the morning. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't just a bad night. Something was wrong, something bigger than I understood, and it wasn't going to fix itself. The next morning, I packed a bag. It wasn't that I wanted to leave. I didn't. But the look in Maris's eyes, the way she didn't even try to stop Vesper from saying those things, it left me feeling like a stranger in my own home. I couldn't keep trying to fix something if they didn't want me there. I had to step back. Maybe some time apart would help them see what they were throwing away. Maybe it would give me the chance to figure out where it all went wrong. I grabbed my old duffel bag from the closet, shoved in a few days' worth of clothes, and left before anyone else woke up. I didn't want to face them, not like this. I drove aimlessly for a while, the roads almost empty in the early morning light. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as I tried to hold myself together. I thought about calling Noah, my oldest friend, but what would I even say? I couldn't bring myself to explain that my own daughter didn't want me anymore, that my wife didn't seem to care. So I just kept driving, letting the hum of the engine and the rush of the wind through the windows drown out the chaos in my mind. Eventually, I checked into a motel off the highway. It was a nondescript place, the kind of motel you wouldn't think twice about if you drove past it. But it had a bed, a shower, and a lock on the door. That was enough. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the old, faded wallpaper, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my texts. No messages from Maris. No calls from Vesper. Nothing. The emptiness was deafening. I tried to convince myself that they just needed time. that I was doing the right thing by giving them space. But the longer I stared at that blank screen, the more I felt the weight of their silence. It was like they'd already made their decision, and it didn't include me. The following days blurred together. I spent hours walking through parks, sitting in coffee shops, driving around town just to keep moving. Anything to avoid being alone with my thoughts. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Vesper's words, "Why don't you just disappear?" echoed in my head, a constant reminder of the rift between us. I couldn't understand it. I'd always been there for her. I was the one who stayed up late helping her with her school projects. The one who cheered the loudest at her soccer games. The one who knew how to make her laugh when she was feeling down. I couldn't reconcile the girl I raised with the young woman who wanted me gone. It was during one of those aimless drives that I decided to stop by Noah's place. I hadn't spoken to him in a while, but he'd always been the person I turned to when things got rough. He didn't ask too many questions, didn't judge, he just listened. When I walked into his garage, he was tinkering with an old engine, grease smudged on his hands, the smell of motor oil filling the air. "Maddox," he said, looking up from his work. "You look like you've been through hell." I tried to brush it off with a half-hearted smile, but he wasn't buying it. "Come on," he said, pulling a couple of beers from the fridge. "Tell me what's going on." I hesitated. Where did I even start? But once I began talking, it all spilled out: the fight with Vesper, Maris's cold indifference, the crushing feeling that my family didn't need me anymore. Noah listened quietly, his expression darkening as I went on. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "That doesn't sound like the Vesper the first remember," he said. "You think there's something else going on? Something she's not telling you?" His words hit me like a jolt. I'd been so focused on my own pain that I hadn't stopped to consider that maybe Vesper's anger wasn't just about me. Maybe there was something or someone pushing her in that direction. That thought lingered in my mind as I drove back to the motel. What if this wasn't just a phase? What if someone else was pulling the strings? I tried to remember if Vesper had mentioned any new friends, any new influences in her life. But nothing came to mind. She had been so closed off lately, so distant. That night, I scrolled through her social media profiles, looking for any clue, any hint of what might be going on. And that's when I saw it. A comment on one of her recent posts from a name I hadn't seen in years: Ronan. My chest tightened. Ronan was Vesper's biological father, but he'd been out of the picture since she was a baby. He never called, never sent a birthday card, never showed any interest in being a part of her life. And now, out of nowhere, he was leaving comments on her posts. I felt a surge of anger and fear. What the hell was he doing? Did Maris know about this? Was this why she had been so distant lately? A million questions flooded my mind. But one thing was clear: Ronan was back, and he was reaching out to Vesper. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. He was feeding her lies, telling her what she wanted to hear, making her think he cared, that he could be the father she thought she was missing. And in her confusion, she was buying into it. I spent the rest of the night piecing it together, every little interaction between Vesper and me over the past few months taking on new meaning. Her sudden distance, her anger, her hostility. It all made sense now. Ronan had planted the seeds, and they were growing into a wedge between us. But why? Why now, after all these years? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that it didn't matter why. What mattered was stopping him before he tore my family apart even more. I couldn't let him get away with it. I couldn't let him take Vesper from me. I had to find a way to reach her before it was too late. The next morning, I called Noah again. "I need your help," I said. "I think I know what's going on, but I need to be sure. I need to know if Ronan's been talking to her, what he's been telling her. Can you help me find out?" Noah didn't hesitate. "Whatever you need, Maddox. We'll figure this out." His support gave me a sliver of hope, but I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. I had to be careful. I couldn't push Vesper too hard or she'd shut me out completely. But I also couldn't stand by and let Ronan poison her against me. I had to fight for her, for us. Because if I didn't, I'd lose her forever. And that was a possibility I couldn't bear. We've come this far, but I have to ask, what do you think happens next? Does my daughter finally see the truth about her mother's lies? Or does the betrayal cut even deeper than I imagined? Let me know in the comments. Press 1 if you think she'll come around, or press 2 if you think the lies only get worse. The first thing I did was call Olivia. If anyone could help me dig into Ronan's background, it was her. She wasn't just a friend, she was someone who knew how to find answers, someone who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. I remember sitting in the parking lot of a run-down diner when she finally picked up. "Maddox," she said, her tone sharp. "What's going on? I haven't heard from you in months." Her voice had that edge I'd come to depend on, a no-nonsense approach that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely alone in this mess. I explained everything: the distance with Vesper, the fight, the sudden reappearance of Ronan. I told her how I'd found his comments on Vesper's social media, how I couldn't figure out how long he'd been back, or what exactly he was after. I told her I needed to know who he was now, not who he used to be. I needed to know what he'd been up to, where he'd been, what he might be trying to pull. Olivia didn't hesitate. "Give me a day," she said, her voice firm. "I'll see what I can dig up." I sat in my truck for a long time after that call, staring at the steering wheel, my mind running in circles. The diner's neon sign flickered against the dark sky, casting a cold light on the dashboard. I had never felt so out of my depth. Vesper was slipping further away from me, and Ronan's shadow loomed larger every day. I thought about the man I remembered from so many years ago, a charming, manipulative coward who had walked out without a second thought. He had left me to pick up the pieces, left me to be the one Vesper called Dad. I had done everything I could to give her a stable life, to be the rock she needed. But now he was back, and somehow, he was getting into her head. That thought alone made my stomach turn. How long had he been feeding her his lies? How long had he been spinning his story, positioning himself as the father she thought she was missing? By the next morning, Olivia had results. "You're not going to like this," she said over the phone. "Ronan's been busy. He's been in and out of a few sketchy business ventures, quick money schemes that fall apart as soon as they start. He's racked up debts, burned bridges. But here's the kicker, he's got just enough charm to keep finding new marks. He's a professional manipulator, Maddox. And from what I've found, it looks like he's turned his attention to Vesper." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "He's been messaging her for weeks now. Long messages about how he's changed, how he wants to make up for lost time, promising her the world, telling her he can give her a life she deserves, the whole 9 yards. And Maddox, I think she's starting to believe him." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to say. "So what do I do now?" I asked, my voice rough. Olivia sighed. "You have to get ahead of him. Show Vesper who he really is before he sinks his hooks in any deeper. But you have to be careful. If you come on too strong, she'll push you away even more." That advice echoed in my mind as I drove back toward town. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, balancing between protecting Vesper and losing her. My head spun with everything Olivia had uncovered. Ronan wasn't just reaching out, he was running a full-blown operation. Every word he said, every promise he made, it was calculated. He wasn't just after Vesper's trust, he was after control. I thought about the way Vesper had been acting lately, distant, defensive, even angry. It all made sense now. He had gotten to her. He was filling her head with the idea that I was the bad guy, that he was the hero coming back to save her. It made me sick. That evening, I parked outside Vesper's high school. I had no idea what I was going to say, but I knew I needed to start somewhere. I waited until the kids started trickling out after soccer practice. When I spotted her, I stepped out of the truck and called her name. She stopped mid-step, her expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp. I took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you. Can we go for a drive?" Her shoulders stiffened. "I'm fine. I don't need a ride." "Please, Vez," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just give me a few minutes. That's all I'm asking." She hesitated, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. "Fine," she muttered, finally walking toward the truck. She climbed in and crossed her arms, staring straight ahead. The tension in the cab was so thick I could barely breathe. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I tried to find the words. I couldn't come at her full force, I had to ease into it. But every second that passed, I felt the pressure mounting. If I didn't get through to her now, I might not get another chance. I kept my tone calm. Vesper. I know you've been talking to Ronan. Her eyes flashed toward me, then quickly back to the window. So what? I just need you to be careful, I said, choosing my words carefully. He's not who you think he is. He's... Don't, she snapped, cutting me off. I know what you're going to say. You don't trust him. You think he's some kind of monster. But you don't even know him, Dad. You don't know what he's been telling me. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and it caught me off guard. There was emotion there, something raw and real that she was trying to hide. You're right, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know everything he's told you, but I do know what he's done in the past. I know he left you. I know he left us. And I know he's hurt a lot of people along the way. I just don't want to see him hurt you too. Her jaw tightened. People change. I gripped the steering wheel harder. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they just get better at hiding who they really are. I'm not asking you to hate him. I'm just asking you to be careful. I'm asking you to look at the facts. If he's really changed, he'll prove it over time. But if he's just feeding you lies, you need to see it before it's too late. She didn't respond right away. The silence in the truck was deafening, and every second felt like an hour. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes glistening. You're always telling me what to do, she said quietly. Why can't you just let me figure this out on my own? My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Because I'm your dad, Vess. And it's my job to protect you, even when you don't want me to. The rest of the drive was silent, but something had shifted. She didn't slam the door when she got out. She didn't storm off. She just gave me a long, searching look before walking toward the house. I sat in the truck for a while after that, staring at the empty seat beside me, wondering if I'd done enough. Wondering if I'd gotten through to her at all. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I'd taken the first step. I sat in my truck, after dropping Vesper off, the heaviness in my chest growing with every second. The conversation hadn't gone the way I'd hoped. Instead of getting through to her, I felt like I'd pushed her further away. I replayed every word in my head, wondering if I'd said too much, not enough, or just the wrong thing altogether. The glow of the dashboard lights cast a faint greenish hue over the cab, but it did nothing to brighten my mood. I knew she was hurting. I could see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice. But what was I supposed to do when she refused to let me in? I gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the empty street. The quiet of the neighborhood felt almost eerie, the occasional porch light flickering in the distance. Vesper had always been independent, smart, strong-willed, but now, that independence felt like a wall I couldn't climb. And the worst part was knowing that Ronan was the one standing on the other side, feeding her every doubt, every suspicion, every lie about me. I turned the key in the ignition and drove aimlessly, the hum of the engine the only sound in the darkness. My mind raced. I thought back to when she was younger, when she used to sit in the passenger seat singing along to the radio. She'd been so open, so full of life. It was hard to reconcile that image with the distant, guarded teenager who'd been sitting next to me just minutes ago. I couldn't help but blame Ronan. He'd planted a seed of mistrust in her mind, and it had taken root. He was undoing everything I'd spent years building, every ounce of trust, every shared moment, every bond we'd formed. And he was doing it from the shadows, without ever having to face me directly. I hated him for it. I hated that he'd left, that he'd been gone all these years, and that he'd had the audacity to show up now, when Vesper was most vulnerable. But more than that, I hated that he was winning. I drove past the gas station where Vesper and I used to stop for snacks on the way to her soccer games. I could almost hear her laughter, as she debated between the blue Gatorade or the red one, always picking the red in the end. Those days felt like another lifetime. I gritted my teeth, my jaw tightening. I couldn't let Ronan take that from us. I couldn't let him rewrite the story of our family. But how could I fight someone who was so good at hiding in the shadows? Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate her emotions, how to make her question everything she thought she knew. Every answer I came up with felt inadequate, every plan too risky. If I confronted him directly, I'd play right into his hands. If I backed off, I'd lose her completely. I ended up at the diner on Main Street, the one with the peeling paint on the sign and the faded red booths inside. It was nearly empty. Just a couple of truckers at the counter and a waitress, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. I slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl seat squeaking under me. The waitress shuffled over, her pen hovering above her notepad. "Just coffee," I said, not meeting her eyes. She nodded and walked away without a word. I stared out the window, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. My reflection stared back at me, tired and worn. I hardly recognized myself. It wasn't just the exhaustion or the worry, it was the feeling of failure. I'd always thought of myself as someone who could handle anything life threw my way, someone who could protect the people I loved. But sitting there in that diner, I felt powerless. The coffee arrived, black and steaming, and I took a sip without adding sugar or cream. It was bitter, but at least it was warm. I leaned back in the booth, trying to clear my head. I needed a plan, something that wouldn't just push Vesper further away. I thought about Olivia's words. She'd warned me not to come on too strong, not to let my anger drive my actions. But how could I not be angry? I wasn't angry at Vesper, I was angry at Ronan. Angry that he was using her as a pawn, that he was exploiting her insecurities, that he was taking advantage of the cracks in our relationship. And I was angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. I should have known he'd try something like this. I should have been prepared. Instead, I was scrambling to fix something that felt like it was slipping out of my hands faster than I could catch it. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This wasn't about me. It wasn't about my pride, my hurt feelings, or my need to prove Ronan wrong. It was about Vesper. It was about making sure she didn't get pulled into his web. Making sure she didn't lose herself in his lies. I opened my eyes and stared into the dark coffee, the reflection of the overhead light bouncing off its surface. I had to keep trying. I had to find a way to show her the truth without pushing her away. I couldn't let Ronan win. He might have the upper hand now, but I wasn't going to give up. Vesper was worth the fight. She was worth every ounce of effort, every sleepless night, every painful conversation. I had to believe that. I had to believe that the bond we once had was still there, buried beneath the anger and confusion. And I had to believe that I could help her see it again. Because if I didn't, who else would? I decided to take Olivia's advice and keep a low profile. If I came at Ronan too hard too soon, it would only backfire. I needed to stay calm, focused, and above all else, strategic. The next morning, I pored over the notes Olivia had sent me. It was all there, his past failures, his debts, the trail of lies he'd left behind in every city he'd touched. But the one thing that really stood out was how good he was at covering his tracks. Every scam he pulled seemed to vanish into thin air, the moment it started to crumble. He was slippery, a professional manipulator, and that made him dangerous. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a man reconnecting with his daughter. He was after something, and he didn't care who got hurt in the process. But what was it? Money? Power? Revenge? It had to be more than just trying to look good in front of Vesper. It was too calculated, too deliberate. I just couldn't figure out his angle. When I finally looked up from the notes, the sun was already high in the sky. I hadn't even noticed the hours slipping by. My coffee had gone cold, and the once quiet street outside my motel window was now bustling with cars and pedestrians. I rubbed my face and stood up, my legs stiff from sitting too long. I knew I couldn't stay locked in that room all day, stewing over the same information. I needed to do something, anything, to keep myself from drowning in doubt and anger. I grabbed my jacket, my phone, and the keys to the truck and headed out. The day was crisp and bright, but I barely noticed. My mind was still spinning with everything I'd read. How did he get to her? How did he convince Vesper to trust him after all this time? And why did Mara seem so indifferent? Did she know he was back before I did? Was she complicit in some way, or was she just as in the dark as I had been? I drove aimlessly, the familiar sights of town blurring past my window. I passed the coffee shop where Vesper and I used to stop on Saturday mornings, her favorite bakery, the bookstore where she'd spend hours flipping through novels and graphic novels, her face lighting up every time she found a new series to dive into. Every corner of this town held a memory of her, and every memory felt a little more fragile now. I had to find a way to get through to her. But how could I fight the pull of a man who'd spent years perfecting the art of manipulation? How could I compete with the promise of something new? Something shiny. Something that felt like freedom to a 16-year-old girl. I ended up back at the diner, the same booth by the window where I'd been the night before. This time, I wasn't alone for long. Olivia showed up, her hair pulled back into a ponytail, a folder under her arm, and that determined look on her face that told me she meant business. She slid into the booth across from me and dropped the folder onto the table. "Maddox," she said, her voice low and serious. "You were right, he's up to something. And it's worse than we thought." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" She opened the folder, spreading out a series of documents, bank statements, emails, photos, even a few handwritten notes that looked like they'd been ripped out of a planner. "Ronan's been setting up a new shell company," she said, tapping one of the documents. "It's barely off the ground, but he's already targeting investors. Small ones. Easy marks. And he's using Vesper as a way in." I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. "What do you mean he's using her?" "He's painting a picture of a perfect little family reunion," Olivia said, her tone flat. "The prodigal father returns. The daughter welcomes him with open arms. And suddenly, he's a changed man. Investors eat that kind of story up. They see a guy who's turned his life around, a guy with a fresh start, and they want to be part of it. He's banking on Vesper's innocence or trust to sell his lie." I clenched my fists under the table, my jaw tightening. "And she has no idea, does she?" Olivia shook her head. "Not a clue. She thinks he's being genuine, that he just wants to reconnect. She doesn't see the bigger picture. Not yet." I let out a long breath, trying to steady myself. The thought of Ronan exploiting Vesper like that made me sick. She was still just a kid. She didn't know the games people played, the lengths they go to for money or power. She didn't know how dangerous it was to let someone like Ronan back into her life. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice low and steady. Olivia looked at me, her expression hard. "We expose him. We gather every piece of evidence we can find. And we show Vesper the truth. We make it impossible for him to deny what he's doing." My chest tightened. "And if she doesn't believe us?" Olivia paused, her brow furrowing. "Then we keep going. We don't stop until she sees it. But we have to tread carefully, Maddox. If we push too hard, she'll dig her heels in. She'll defend him because she thinks we're just trying to tear them apart. We need to show her, not just tell her. We need her to see it for herself." I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. I couldn't lose my cool. I couldn't let my anger take over. This wasn't just about proving Ronan wrong, it was about protecting Vesper. I had to stay calm, stay focused. I had to be the steady hand she needed, even if she didn't realize it yet. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. I knew Ronan wouldn't give up easily. He was too slick, too smooth, too used to getting what he wanted. And I knew Vesper wouldn't let go of the idea that maybe, just maybe, her biological father wasn't the villain I made him out to be. She wanted to believe in him. She wanted to believe that he could be the man she'd always dreamed of. And that made my job even harder. But no matter how hard it got, no matter how many times I felt like I was hitting a brick wall, I wasn't going to give up. I wasn't going to let Ronan win. Vesper was my daughter, my family, and I would fight for her until there was nothing left. I would find a way to show her the truth. I had to, because losing her wasn't an option. I'd already come too far to turn back now. I spent the next few days gathering my thoughts and trying to figure out my next move. The more I learned about Ronan's schemes, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about Vesper and me. He was building a house of cards, and Vesper was the cornerstone. I knew I had to confront him, but I couldn't do it without proof. The last thing I wanted was for him to twist the narrative and turn Vesper even further against me. I needed something solid, something undeniable. Olivia was already working on digging up more dirt, but that would take time. Meanwhile, I had to keep Vesper close enough to listen and calm enough not to bolt. It was a delicate balance, and one wrong move could send it all crumbling down. One night, as I sat alone in the living room with a half-empty beer and a mind full of questions, my phone buzzed. It was Olivia. "I've got something," she said, her voice low. "Meet me at the cafe tomorrow morning. Don't bring Vesper. This is just between us." Her tone sent a chill through me. She was never one for melodrama, so I knew whatever she had found must be important. "I'll be there," I said, hanging up and staring at the screen as if it held all the answers I needed. The cafe was quiet when I arrived. It was still early, the kind of morning where the air feels crisp, and the world hasn't quite woken up yet. I found Olivia in a corner booth, a stack of papers and a laptop in front of her. She looked up as I approached, and I could tell from her expression that this wasn't going to be good news. "Maddox," she said, motioning for me to sit. "We need to talk." I slid into the booth, my hands clasped together on the table. "What did you find?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Ronan's not just conning Vesper. He's been siphoning money from multiple accounts, small amounts at first, but it's adding up. He's setting her up to take the fall. Maddox, if things go south, she's going to look like an accomplice." My chest tightened. "How?" She pulled out a printout of bank transactions, pointing to the highlighted lines. "He's been moving money through an account in her name. It's a joint account she didn't even know existed. He set it up months ago. On paper, it looks like she's been funneling funds into his business, but it's all him. If someone blows the whistle, the authorities will come after her first." I stared at the printout, the numbers and names blurring together. "So he's setting her up as his scapegoat," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If this goes public, she'll be the one left holding the bag." Olivia nodded. "Exactly. And once that happens, he'll be long gone. He's done it before, Maddox. This is his pattern. He uses someone close to him, builds up trust, then vanishes the moment things start falling apart. But this time, it's your daughter." I felt a surge of anger rise in me, hot and sharp. "We have to stop him," I said, my hands balling into fists. "I can't let him do this to her." Olivia placed a hand on my arm, her voice steady. "We will. But we have to be smart about it. If we confront him without hard evidence, he'll deny everything, spin it back on you. And Vesper will believe him. She's already halfway there. She's not ready to hear the truth yet." I sat back, running a hand through my hair. "So what do we do?" She pushed another document across the table. "We build a case. I'm still working on tracking down his previous scams, finding people who can confirm his pattern. But you need to keep Vesper close. Keep her talking. Don't push her away, no matter how much she resists. She needs to feel like she can still trust you, even if she doesn't see it now." Her words echoed in my head as I drove back home. The anger, the frustration, the helplessness, it was all still there, but now it had a focus. I couldn't confront Ronan directly, not yet. I had to wait for Olivia to finish digging, to gather the kind of evidence that would leave no room for doubt. And in the meantime, I had to find a way to keep Vesper from slipping any further into his grasp. I had to remind her of the bond we once had. To show her that no matter how hard things got, I wasn't going anywhere. It was easier said than done. When I walked through the door, the house felt empty. Vesper was in her room, and Maris was still at work. I stood in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. There was one of Vesper when she was about 7, grinning ear to ear, her arm wrapped around my shoulders. I remembered that day, our trip to the lake, the way she had jumped into the water with no fear, laughing as I tried to keep up. She had been so full of life, so open and trusting. I wondered how we had gotten here, how Ronan had managed to plant seeds of doubt in her mind so quickly. But more than that, I wondered if I could ever get back to that place where she trusted me unconditionally. I set the photo back on the shelf and headed upstairs. I stopped outside her door, hesitating. I knew she wouldn't want to talk, but I had to try. I knocked lightly. "Vesper, it's me. Can I come in?" There was a long pause before she replied. "It's open." I stepped inside, and she was sitting on her bed, her laptop open on her lap, earbuds in. She pulled one out and looked at me. "What's up?" I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to push too hard, didn't want to scare her off. I just wanted to check in. "See how you're doing." She shrugged, her eyes flicking back to her screen. "I'm fine." I sat down on the edge of her bed, keeping my tone light. "Listen, I know things have been weird lately. I know you're mad at me, but I'm still here. I'm always going to be here, no matter what." She didn't say anything, but I could see the flicker of something in her eyes, doubt, maybe, or uncertainty. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. "Ves," I said, my voice soft. "If there's ever anything you need to talk about, anything at all, you can come to me. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just here to help. Okay? She nodded slightly, still not looking at me. Okay, she murmured. I stood up, not wanting to overstay my welcome. I'll let you get back to whatever you're doing. Just remember that. All right? She nodded again, and I left her room, closing the door gently behind me. I leaned against the hallway wall, letting out a breath. I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I didn't know if I'd gotten through to her. Didn't know if she believed me, but at least I'd made the effort. I'd planted a seed, just like Ronan had. But mine wasn't a seed of doubt or manipulation, it was a seed of trust, of hope. I just had to hope it would grow. I sat on the couch that night, staring at the faint glow of the TV, without actually watching it. My thoughts were too loud, drowning out the soft hum of the news anchor's voice. The room felt cold, even though the heat was turned up. The last few weeks had chipped away at me Ronan's manipulations, Vesper pulling further and further away, the constant fear that I'd lose her completely. But tonight, something shifted. I wasn't just angry anymore. I wasn't just hurt. I was ready. Ready to stop waiting, to stop hoping Ronan would slip up, to stop tiptoeing around Vesper's fragile trust. I needed to confront him directly. I needed to end this. Olivia's words from earlier that day echoed in my head. She had uncovered more evidence, emails, transactions, even a few recorded phone calls that linked Ronan to his previous scams. He's running the same playbook, she'd said, her tone grim. He sets up a small, seemingly innocent operation, lures in a few investors, then vanishes once the money's gone. The difference this time is that he's got Vesper as his shield. If someone comes looking for him, she's the one they'll find. Those words lit a fire in me. He wasn't just targeting her trust, he was jeopardizing her future, her freedom. I couldn't let that stand. I grabbed my keys off the counter and headed for the door. The night air hit me like a cold slap. The sky was clear, stars scattered across the black canvas, but I barely noticed. My mind was already racing, running through every possible scenario. I didn't know if Ronan would even listen to me, let alone admit to anything, but I didn't care. I wasn't looking for a confession. I just wanted him to know that I was onto him, that I wasn't going to sit back and let him ruin Vesper's life. I got in the truck, the engine roaring to life, and drove toward the address Olivia had found. It was a small, nondescript apartment complex on the edge of town, the kind of place where people lived when they didn't want to be found. The building loomed ahead, its faded brick exterior and dimly lit parking lot making it look more like a prison than a home. I parked near the entrance, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding, a mix of adrenaline and dread coursing through me. I didn't know what I'd find when I walked through those doors. I didn't know if he'd even be there. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting him continue to twist Vesper's mind and use her as a pawn, was too much to bear. I stepped out of the truck, the sound of the door closing echoing in the still night. My boots crunched on the gravel as I made my way to the entrance. I pushed open the heavy metal door and was greeted by the sterile smell of industrial cleaner and the flicker of fluorescent lights overhead. The hallway was empty, silent except for the faint hum of an air conditioning unit. I checked the slip of paper in my pocket, the apartment number scribbled in Olivia's handwriting, and headed toward the stairs. My pulse quickened with every step. When I reached his door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the worn brass knocker, the reality of what I was about to do sinking in. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a declaration of war. And once I crossed that line, there was no going back. I knocked, the sound loud and sharp in the quiet hallway. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard shuffling inside, a low, irritated groan, and the click of locks being undone. The door opened just enough to reveal Ronan's face, his eyes narrowing as he saw me. "What the hell are you doing here?" he said, his voice low, but with an edge of annoyance. I took a step forward, not giving him a chance to shut the door. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was still racing. Ronan sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing. Save it," I cut him off. "I know exactly what you're doing. I know about the fake business, the investors, the account in Vesper's name. I know it all." His expression hardened, the casual irritation replaced by something colder. "You don't know anything," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous calm. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so no one in the neighboring apartments would hear. You're using her, Ronan. You're making her your scapegoat, and when it all falls apart, she's the one who's going to take the hit. Not you. You'll disappear, just like you always do, and leave her to pick up the pieces. For a moment, Ronan didn't respond. He just stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes calculating. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the quick mental math he was doing to figure out how much I knew, and how much I was bluffing. Finally, he smirked, a thin, mocking grin. You think you've got it all figured out, huh? He said, leaning against the doorframe. You've always been so self-righteous. Always playing the hero. You think you're protecting her, but you're just driving her further away. She doesn't trust you, Maddox. She never will. Those words stung more than I wanted to admit, but I didn't let it show. You don't know her, I said evenly. You don't know anything about her. All you see is a way to get what you want. But that's not going to work this time. His smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something darker. And what are you going to do, Maddox? Call the cops? Show them your little folder of documents? By the time you figure out how to take me down, I'll be long gone. You're wasting your time. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to a dangerous whisper. Maybe. Or maybe I'll make sure you never get the chance. Maybe I'll take that evidence and show it to Vesper. Maybe I'll make her see the truth about who you really are. You think you've got her wrapped around your finger, but she's smarter than you give her credit for. And when she realizes what you've done, when she sees that you were ready to throw her under the bus, just to save your own skin, she'll never forgive you. His eyes darkened, his smirk now completely gone. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. You don't scare me, he said quietly. You never have. I didn't flinch. I don't need to scare you. I just need to stop you. For a long moment, we stood there, the tension crackling between us like a live wire. Finally, Ronan stepped back, his expression unreadable. You're making a big mistake, he said, his tone low. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. I met his gaze, my jaw set. We'll see about that. Without another word, I turned and walked away. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling slightly, but I didn't look back. I knew he was watching me go, probably plotting his next move. But it didn't matter. I'd made my stand. And I wasn't going to back down. I drove home in silence, the events of that confrontation replaying in my head. Ronan's smirk, his calm threats, the way he tried to twist everything I said. I couldn't shake the image. He thought he had the upper hand, that I'd just walk away and let him win. But if anything, that conversation had steeled my resolve. I knew now that there was no reasoning with him. He was too slick, too practiced in his deceit. The only way to beat him was to outmaneuver him, to show Vesper the truth so clearly that she couldn't deny it anymore. But damn, that was going to be a fight. When I got home, the house was dark except for the dim glow of the hallway light. I stepped inside quietly, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Maris was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of wine in her hand. Her expression was unreadable, but I could tell she'd been waiting up. She didn't say anything as I closed the door behind me and kicked off my boots. I paused in the entryway, feeling her eyes on me. I talked to him, I said finally, my voice low. He knows I'm onto him. Her grip on the wineglass tightened, but she didn't look at me. And, she asked, her tone flat. And he didn't deny it, I said, stepping into the kitchen. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's setting her up to take the fall, Maris. If we don't stop him now, she's the one who's going to pay for it. I expected her to argue, to defend him like she'd done before, but instead, she just stood there, staring at her wineglass like it held all the answers she didn't have. You don't get it, do you? She said finally, her voice quiet but firm. She's not a little girl anymore, Maddox. You can't just swoop in and fix everything. She's going to make her own choices, and you can't force her to see what you see. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. This isn't about choices. It's about him using her, manipulating her into something she doesn't understand. He's dangerous, Maris. You know that as well as I do. She looked at me then, her eyes tired, her face drawn. You think I don't see what he's doing? I see it. I just don't know how to stop it. Every time I try to talk to her, she shuts me out. She thinks I'm taking your side. She thinks we're ganging up on her. I felt a flicker of frustration, But I kept my tone steady. She's scared. She's confused. That's what he's counting on. But if we don't show her the truth now, he'll keep pulling her further away. And then it won't matter what we say or do. She'll be gone, Maris. Not just from this house, but from us. Maris turned away, setting her glass on the counter with a sharp clink. You don't think I know that, she said, her voice rising slightly. You think I want this to happen? I'm trying, Maddox. I'm trying to reach her, but it's like she's already made up her mind. She hasn't, I said firmly. She's just confused. He's got her wrapped up in this fantasy of who he wants her to believe he is. But if we work together, if we can get her to listen, maybe we can still get through to her. Maris let out a long breath, her shoulders slumping. And what if we can't? I didn't have an answer to that. The thought of losing Vesper to Ronan's lies, of watching her walk down a path that would only lead to heartbreak and trouble. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let that happen. We don't have a choice, I said quietly. We have to try. She nodded, though she didn't look convinced. Then what do we do now? Olivia's working on more evidence, I said. When we have enough, we'll show it to Vesper. Not to accuse her, not to push her further away, but to make her see the truth. If we can show her what he's really doing, maybe just maybe she'll realize who she can really trust. Maris picked up her glass again, swirling the wine absently. You better be right, she said softly. Because if this backfires, we're going to lose her forever. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I knew she was right. This was a gamble. But it was the only one we had left. I went upstairs, my footsteps heavy, my mind still racing. As I reached Vesper's door, I stopped, listening. I could hear the faint sound of music coming from inside, the soft murmur of her voice as she talked on the phone. I didn't want to interrupt her. I didn't want to push her away any more than I already had. Instead, I stood there for a moment, wondering what she was saying, who she was talking to. I could only hope it wasn't him. I turned and headed to my own room, closing the door behind me. The bed felt cold and unfamiliar, and sleep didn't come easy. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Ronan, with Maris, with Olivia. I didn't know if we were making progress, or just treading water. I didn't know if Vesper was starting to see through Ronan's lies, or if she was falling deeper under his spell. But I knew one thing, I couldn't stop now. I had to keep fighting, no matter how long it took, no matter how much it hurt. Because if I gave up, if I let him win, I'd lose her forever. And that wasn't something I was willing to accept. So I stared at the ceiling, the minutes stretching into hours, the room growing darker and quieter with each passing moment. But I didn't close my eyes. Not yet. There was too much at stake. I had to be ready. I had to stay sharp. Because when the time came when we finally had everything we needed, I was going to make sure Ronan never had the chance to hurt Vesper again. I was going to make him pay. As the final pieces fell into place, I could feel the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on me like an unrelenting storm. I knew this confrontation would be the climax, the moment when everything would either break apart for good or finally start to mend. The evidence Olivia had gathered was solid emails, bank records, even a few carefully captured phone conversations. It was enough to paint a clear picture of Ronan's deceit and manipulation. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that none of it would matter, that Vesper's faith in him had sunk too deep, that she would refuse to see what was right in front of her. The thought was like a splinter under my skin, a constant, nagging ache that wouldn't let me rest. But I couldn't focus on the what-ifs now. It was time to act. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when we finally sat down in the living room, me, Maris, and Vesper. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as though the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to happen. Vesper sat stiffly on the couch, her arms crossed, her gaze pointedly avoiding mine. Maris sat in the chair by the window, her expression calm, but her hands gripping the armrest just a little too tightly. The light streaming through the window caught on the dust motes in the air, making them look almost like sparks. It was a fitting backdrop for what felt like a ticking time bomb. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. Vesper, I began, my words slow and deliberate. There's something we need to talk about. And I need you to really hear me out this time. She glanced up, her face guarded. What now? She asked, her tone laced with irritation. Is this another lecture about how I don't know what I'm doing? No, I said firmly. It's not a lecture. It's just the truth. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't say anything. I took that as my cue to keep going. I know you think Ronan is trying to help you, I said. I know he's made a lot of promises, and told you things that sound good, things you want to believe. But there are things you don't know. Things he hasn't told you. She opened her mouth, but I held up a hand to stop her. Please. Just let me finish. This is important. I pulled a folder from the coffee table and set it on my lap, flipping it open. We've been looking into him, into his past. And what we found, it's bad, Vess. He's been running scams for years. He targets people who trust him, gets them to invest in fake businesses, and then he disappears. He leaves them with nothing but debt and broken promises. She frowned, shifting uncomfortably. That doesn't mean, it does, I said, cutting her off gently. Because you're his target this time. The account in your name, the money he's been moving through it, it's all part of the same pattern. He's setting you up, Vess. If this all comes crashing down, you'll be the one who gets blamed. Not him. You. Her arms tightened across her chest, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't fully convinced, but she wasn't dismissing it out of hand either. That was something. I glanced over at Maris, who nodded slightly. It was my signal to push just a little harder. Vesper, I said, my voice softer now. I know you've been feeling like you need to prove yourself, like you need to find your own path. I get that, I really do. But this isn't the way. Ronan doesn't care about you the way you think he does. He's not trying to help you. He's just using you to cover his own tracks. She shook her head, but her voice was quieter this time. He said he wanted to help me get out of this place, to start over somewhere new. He said he believed in me. He's lying, I said, my words gentle but firm. He's telling you exactly what you want to hear because that's what he does. It's what he's always done. I know it's hard to accept, but you have to see it for what it is. For a long moment, the room was silent. Vesper stared at the folder in my hands, her jaw tight. I could see the conflict in her expression. The battle between wanting to believe Ronan and starting to question whether she could. It was a small crack, but it was enough. I leaned forward slightly, my voice softening even more. You're my daughter, Vess, I said. I've always had your back. I always will. But right now, I need you to trust me, even just a little. I'm not saying you can't make your own choices. I'm just asking you to look at the facts and see what's really happening. She glanced over at Maris, as if seeking confirmation. Maris nodded, her voice calm and steady. It's true, sweetheart. We didn't want to believe it either. But we can't just stand by and let him hurt you. Vesper's eyes flicked back to me, and I could see the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crumble. Her voice was barely above a whisper. What do you want me to do? I let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in my chest ease just a little. Just listen, I said. Look at the evidence. Ask yourself if what he's been telling you adds up. And if it doesn't, let us help you figure out how to deal with it. We'll do it together. She didn't respond right away, but she didn't shut down either. That was enough for now. I set the folder on the coffee table and leaned back, giving her the space she needed. The hardest part was done. I'd shown her the truth. Now it was up to her to decide what to do with it. The hours that followed were quiet. Vesper stayed in the living room, flipping through the folder, reading the emails, studying the bank records. Maris sat with her, offering silent support. I stayed nearby, not wanting to hover, but ready to step in if she had questions. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the living room grew dim. But as the light faded, I felt something else take its place, a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd turned a corner. When Vesper finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was steady. You were right, she said softly. I didn't want to believe it, but it's all there. He lied to me. I nodded, my throat tight. I'm sorry, Vess. I wish it wasn't true. But now that we know, we can move forward. We can make sure he doesn't hurt you, or anyone else ever again. She nodded, wiping her eyes. What do we do now? We stick together, I said. We figure out the next steps as a family. And we don't let him win. It wasn't a perfect ending. There was still a lot of work to do, a lot of trust to rebuild. But in that moment, sitting together in the fading light, it felt like a start. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like we might actually be okay. I didn't know how the story would end, but I fought like hell to save what mattered most. The truth came at a cost, but it was worth every moment. And now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Comment below with your thoughts. Share this video with anyone who's ever faced betrayal. And don't forget to subscribe, because there's always more to the story. In my experience, the hardest lesson was realizing that trust is not given freely, it's earned. People can say all the right things, make the promises you desperately want to believe, but actions always reveal the truth. It taught me to question, to demand transparency, and to value those who prove their loyalty through consistent deeds rather than charming words. This isn't just a personal revelation, it's a principle every American can adopt. By being vigilant, discerning, and holding each other accountable, we strengthen our communities, protect ourselves from manipulation, and foster a society built on integrity and mutual respect.